Hey, welcome to X-Oriente, the new voice of brotherhood. I am one half of your host, Eric Diamond.
I'm the other half of that host, hopefully not the back half, Jason Van Dyke.
I think we're both the front half.
Oh, good. That makes me feel better and worse at the same time.
So, welcome back. We're doing this on a Tuesday night just because we felt we needed a little bit more preparation time for our topic tonight. And that is kind of this idea of reconnecting to our Enlightenment roots. And I wanted to, before we did that though, hang on one second here. Oh, here we go. So I wanted to, we did welcome our new executive producers in the last show, but we'll do it again.
We did. Let's do it again though.
Let's do it again. Jose Vesnor, Bill Garrison, someone named Jorge, who we'll just see if we can get his last name, and those are our newest. I think there might be one more that I haven't gotten them in the system yet, but that'll happen in the next day or two. So thank you very much for pledging your support and becoming an executive producer, and we'll tell you more about how to do that at the end of the show. But today, we wanted to talk about like reconnecting to our Enlightenment roots. A lot of our this season is going to be talking about kind of the Enlightenment and why it's important to Freemasonry, and kind of how do we get back to that and use that as a springboard to social relevance. And so I guess my first question, Jason, is this even something we should be doing? Like, is there a need to connect to our Enlightenment roots? Is this actually the work of Masonry? Is this part of our purpose?
You know, what's really tempting, it's tempting to answer that question flippantly and say something like, well, is it necessary to breathe, Eric? I mean, is that really fundamental to my humanism? And you know, but honestly, I think, I see where you're coming from, but yes, it absolutely is, because I think that, like all journeys of discovery, one must know where they come from. Where did you start? Once you know where you start, you know where you are, you know where you're going to. You can triangulate, positions and all that, that jazz.
But don't we already do that through history?
Well, but we're symbolic, right? Mm-hmm. History is history, but we are a moral philosophy based in symbolism. So one must know their symbolic past as well. Okay. Where does this philosophy come from and why? I think it is. I think it's very necessary to understand our Enlightenment roots. It very, very much helps us understand where we are today and where we're going in the future. Boy, that was a long-winded answer to that, wasn't it?
No, it was great. It was good.
Yeah. By the way, I want to do just a couple of shout outs because Facebook is blowing up. We've got fans, legions of
fantastic. Fantastic.
4 counting me. But Jesse Hopkins Hull, good evening. John Rourke is joining us. Wants to know, I said, it's more awkward than 2 lodges meeting on the same night. 2 podcasts streaming live on a Tuesday night.
I know. But I figured we're going to do ours first, and then you're going to do yours, so it'll be.
He said, "How am I supposed to watch both?" You're not, John. Just do what your heart tells you.
He's discovered our little plan.
Do what your heart tells you, John. And I'm watching the little eyes that are up in the corner of this Facebook Live thing, and if it goes down by 1, I know it's you, and I'm coming for you and your family. Merrill Hawkins, good evening. Hi, how are you? Thanks for showing up and listening to our lunacy. So yeah, now Eric. So what do you think? I mean, now I answered the question. I think that John says I still love you guys.
Oh.
That makes me squishy. God bless you, Rourke. I answered the question. I think you should answer the question.
Okay. So one of the things that it's not really a concern. It's more of an observation, which is that we seem to have, in terms of like intellectual Masonry, and I just sort of distinguish that from like, as our esteemed brother Pete Norman would talk about, spaghetti dinners on paper plates style Masonry, or charity toy drive Masonry or things like that. But the intellectual side of Masonry seems to be firmly in the sort of the esoteric camp, and it seems like that the esoteric side of things and the Enlightenment side of things are kind of opposed. And it's in a way, it's kind of weird because like one of the things that we talked a little bit about a few shows ago about the French obediences, and it's almost like they kind of ditched the esoteric side of things in favor of the Enlightenment side of things and went full bore into that. And we kind of ditched the Enlightenment side of things and went into the esoteric side of things.
I think that's probably fair. I think that I think it's interesting too, because this brings up an issue where like when people ask me like, hey, I'm moving to DC, I'm looking for a lodge, or I'm considering joining Freemasonry, what advice can you give me? I think I always start that, and tell me how you do this, because I'm curious as to if it's kind of the same or different. But I always ask that basically starting questions on, well, what interests you more of these two things? History or comparative religious studies? Philosophy or brotherhood, meaning camaraderie. And sort of a sense of connection with another human being. And it's interesting because I get, you get all these range of answers in that, but it tells me right away where to kind of peg what lodge to push a guy towards, because for each of those answers, I've got 2, 3, 4 lodges that I know I can reliably push him towards to get him at least on the path. And, what's interesting is that it always comes up when I have these conversations with these guys. I'll say, well, your answer indicates to me this. And really there's 2 general and main types of thinking in Freemasonry that are practiced in a lodge. There's an esoteric and there's a more fraternal side to the practice of individual lodges. And I said, now, every lodge has both. It's just in what ratio. So when I ask those questions of guys, what I'm trying to gauge is where is their ratio, and then hopefully match them. How do you handle that? I mean, because do you think of that right away as well?
Kind of. I mean, I'm in a slightly different situation in that, I'm not. You kind of sit up at the apex of like DC Masonry, and in that because you're at the Grand Lodge, you have visibility into all the lodges, so you know them all really well and you know what they're really good at. I don't have that experience in Illinois. I'm sad to say. I probably should, but
sure, but within Chicago, I mean, I'm sure that you've got an idea of the lodges in the greater Chicago area.
Yeah.
Where would you push some?
Some of them. I mean, it depends. It depends on what kind of person it is, and I would have to get to know them a little bit better before I kind of knew. Because some people say they're into esoteric and not really. Like sometimes you get people who are just like full blown occultists and.
Okay. Sure. Sure. Well, I mean, that's the starting question, right? And then it's got a probe to to reveal itself fully, but I think that it's always a good start.
Yeah, no, it is. And you talk about that sort of like that both threads are kind of equally or not equally present, but both are present in Freemason in every lodge. But it's kind of interesting how they're focused, right? So like, one has its goal as the betterment of mankind, right? The progress of humanity. And that's sort of the Enlightenment direction. Right. And the other one is more of a personal inward facing quest that, might involve schools of mystery and esoteric traditions and stuff, mystery schools and, maybe even a little occultism and comparative religion and stuff like that. And so, I think that from a Masonic perspective, the question is begged, which one is the right path? And I think if you ask different Masons, you'll get different opinions, right? You'll get some guys who are just, they see Masonry as a doorway into this esoteric path, and other people, and it's, almost like when you talk about fraternalism, it's kind of like we've lost the philosophical roots of the Enlightenment, and there's lots of reasons for that, which we'll explore in other shows. But I think the remnants of that is charity. Right. The emphasis on charity, the emphasis on community service and things like that, because that is that kind of that sort of phantom limb of, the betterment of mankind and the progress of humanity, right, is doing things for the community. So interestingly, like, I talked about this a little before, but the Grand Lodge Nationale de France, no, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. The Grand Lodge Nationale Français, or the GLNF, which is the Grand Lodge in France that we do recognize, put out this past year their first research journal in English, which is really, really excellent. And in it, there was an article that might shed some light on the navigation of these two paths, right? So, the article was written by brother Antoine. I'm not going to murder his name here. My French is terrible. Antoine Faivre, and he is the professor of emeritus and senior research fellow at the École Pratique des Hautes Études. In other words, the school of the practice of esoteric philosophy, essentially, and or esoteric studies. So he's a historian of Western esotericism. He's an author of several really good books on esoteric thought. And the name of the paper is The Two Lights. And I wanted to kind of discuss it because he deals directly with this question. And he starts out by saying that that there are two great currents of the 18th century which is linked. He says their names carry the notion of light. On the one hand, the spirit of enlightenment, also known as the century of light or the philosophy of enlightenment. On the other hand, illuminism in the broad and esoteric sense of the word. So he's using illuminism as his label, I think, for the esoteric side of things. And so what he does is he kind of goes and he describes the kind of the Enlightenment side of things, and then he describes the Illuminism, the esoteric side of things, and then in the paper he talks about these two conferences that took place in the 18th century where they tried to reconcile the two and decide which path was the better path. And guess what? They couldn't do it. Right? They couldn't figure it out then.
Sure.
And then he had some kind of interesting stuff. So I just wanted to kind of go through a couple of some of his ideas and discuss them a little bit.
Well, before we get to that, I just want to point out, was it just me? But while I was reading this incredible paper, I could not help but have the old Miller Lite ads going in my head. Tastes great. Less filling. Tastes great.
Yes, with a French accent.
Right.
C'est magnifique, you know.
It's much more haughty.
Yeah. So he talks about, so he kind of defines, the spirit of enlightenment. And he says of that, he says that, in the spirit of enlightenment, trust is placed in science and in reason. Freedom of thought and free scrutiny, traits that are part of the legacy of Protestant Reformation, are affirmed. And then he says, and this is kind of interesting, emphasis is placed on self-knowledge and at the same time sociability. And he says this absolutely requires the citizen to be virtuous, right? So I think what he's saying is that it's not just a personal pursuit. Freemasonry is not just about making a good man better. It's about making our world better.
Correct. And it's about starting in the lodge first, right? Starting small. It's a sociability thing. It is not meant, I mean, it's meant to be introspective, but introspective with friends.
Well, but not just friends. Right? I think when he says when he's right. And here's why I think that. So George Washington, in a letter to the King David Lodge in Rhode Island, which was one of the first Jewish lodges in the country. They basically wrote him this letter, just sort of saying, gosh, Mr. President, you're the greatest, and just heaped all this effusive praise on him, and boy, we're really glad you're our president and stuff. And he wrote back like the next day, and he said this: being persuaded that a just application of the principles on which the Masonic fraternity is founded must be promotive. I'm going to back up here. Must be promotive of private virtues and public prosperity. Right? So George Washington kind of, what he's saying is it's not enough to be privately engaged with the practice of Freemasonry.
That's correct.
That light has to go beyond the lodge.
There must be some effect from that introspection and from that focus on yourself has to have an effect that rubs off on those around you. 100%. Yeah, absolutely agree.
And sure. And then he sort of finishes up. He says, I shall always be happy to advance the interests of the society and to be considered by them as a deserving brother. Your pal, George.
Yeah. Hugs and kisses, George.
Right. So his Masonic path was squarely in the path of enlightenment, that sort of idea of private virtue, which he took very, very seriously. Like he was very, Mark Tabbert could do a whole lecture on this, but he was very, very into this idea of private virtue, and his own reputation as a gentleman, but also public prosperity, which I think is a really kind of an interesting idea. And Brother Faivre says that at the societal level, it is the pooling of knowledge and the gains of progress in a spirit of cosmopolitanism. So I had to go look this up, like cosmopolitanism. So basically cosmopolitanism is the idea that we transcend our own nationality, right? That we're all citizens of the world, and we're all, the brotherhood of man under the fatherhood of God, that kind of thing. That, it's not just, in other words, Masonry is not a patriotic booster club. It is not, right?
Right.
It's
not
bigger.
It's not all Americanism.
It's not all Americanism, right? It goes beyond that. On the individual level, it is the virtue called natural, understood as the arranging of personal and social virtues. And then he goes on to say, in this program, atheism was rare. And the attacks of Voltaire, who was not an atheist, were directed at the infamous who, according to him, was not the Catholic Church. Was the Catholic Church, but not against religion in general. The point was not, except in special cases, to fight the Christian faith through non-belief, but to distance oneself from the established religions, and in this case to reject miracles considered as superstition, and above all, to defend individualism in matters of religion, each person being free to choose what suited him. Mm-hmm. So in other words, I think what he was saying there is that like these guys who were these Enlightenment guys were basically saying like, whether or not you believe in, miracles, or whether the earth was created in a, 5 24-hour or 6 24-hour periods of time is mm-hmm. immaterial. You believe whatever you want to believe. But when we talk about truth, that the truth of it has to stand up to external scrutiny that goes beyond our own personal, kind of religious belief.
Okay.
So, because otherwise it is superstition. Like if we can't prove it, then it's just sort of like all we can say is, well, we believe it, we have faith in it, it's unproven, but we can't say it's true. Right. That would be the Enlightenment approach to that kind of question. So it doesn't really mean that there's a conflict, right? We're not saying it didn't happen. We're just saying there's no proof of it, so we can't be conclusive about it. What we can do is say we believe it, mm-hmm. right? But but then it's like my belief and your belief is sort of on equal footing because none of it's based in any empirical evidence, right?
Right.
And he says all the traits of the spirit of enlightenment were present in the Freemasonry of the 18th century. For the Mason, it was a matter of trying to capture the light individually, and in this case, to enlighten his mind by perceiving the moral sense of the symbols conveyed by the rituals. Since they were part of this new positive environment of debate and exchange, the Freemasons cultivated an exploratory discursive ethic of discussion. Now, Brother Faivre is he's a scholar, so he's using, a 3-syllable word when a 1-syllable word will suffice. But
true. And I might mention this article is difficult to get through. It is not just because he's a scholar; he's a French scholar, and so this is translated from the French. It's not like he sat and wrote this in English for us.
We don't know, but
maybe. I mean, he may have, but he's clearly not a native English speaker.
Well, but honestly, he's writing in a very academic style.
Absolutely,
right,
100%. There's a density of thought that requires one to sit down and actually unpack it.
Right.
You've got to go slowly and push through it.
Which is why we're going slowly. But
there we go.
Yeah. So here's what I thought was interesting about that last passage. He said Freemasons cultivated an exploratory, right? Mm-hmm. Which means you leave your preconceptions at the door because we're gonna
right, exactly.
And a discursive ethic of discussion. In other words, we're going to consider different points of view.
Right. It's a two-way street.
Yeah.
It's not a one-way street.
Yeah. And we're going to...
No one's lecturing at you.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to leave ourselves open to the possibility
Correct.
of other ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's how he kind of sums up sort of the spirit of enlightenment in Freemasonry. Then he talks about Illuminism, which I thought was a little bit more interesting. And he describes it. He said the movement really took off in the middle of the 18th century, a so-called pre-romantic period mm-hmm. that saw the multiplication of initiatory societies. Now, for those who don't know, the romantic period has nothing to do with, your sweetheart. It comes from the word for like Roman, like romantic. Mm. And the romantic period was kind of a reaction to the Enlightenment. It was people who were, they were scared of the French Revolution and what it had brought. They were scared of the social upheaval. And so they kind of retreated back from this idea of enlightenment into, a more, kind of looking backwards. So this is when you get, the great romances like, Dracula and Frankenstein, right? Which are these sort of warnings of tampering with things we don't understand. This is when you get, this is when you get spiritualism in the 19th century becomes really popular in seances and things like that.
Correct. Because what happens is that science and the Enlightenment, the natural sciences as they were, start to push the boundaries. and they start to have our new knowledge starts to have consequences, not all of which are intended. And that's what those stories are all about. It's about, hey, you wanted to find the secret of life, and you made a monster, right?
Right.
And that's and what's hilarious about that is that is very much in vogue these days. As we struggle today with the pace of technology as it moves today, look at, I mean, geez, I could go through like 9 movies right now that's the 100% root of it.
Alien, right?
Alien, AI.
What was it? Ex Machina with
Ex Machina, which is an amazing film. Yeah. Amazing film, and actually probably does it in the deepest way of any of the films.
Yeah,
explores these unintended consequences about what happens if. If we look at the logical track that our technology's on, what are we unlocking the door to? Right?
Yeah.
And you can go all the way back to something as simple as war games. What are we unlocking?
Right.
And so it's interesting because when popular culture is making those warnings, at the same time, the intelligentsia kind of go back and they fall back onto, okay, well, all right, that's fair enough. This is dangerous stuff. This is actually physically dangerous. The things that we're producing. We'll go back to thinking about, these old thoughts and these esoteric ideas that are much more internal, and the consequences are relatively personal.
Well, and I think a key characteristic of this time and this mindset was not necessarily just a rejection of progress, right? Or a fear of it, but this idea that somehow things were better in the past, right? So it's a looking backward to, like, in other words, we're looking backward to alchemy. We're looking backward to,
that's right. Absolutely.
Right? And you can see that
trying to find our roots again.
Yeah, and you can see that in the architecture, like romantic Gothic. What do they call it? Neo-Gothic architecture, which is like, like, oh look, we built a castle, with
rib vaults
with windows and central plumbing. Yeah, it's
that's right.
Right. So it's this idea that somehow, and we carry those ideas into today, because like we have these ideas that, like, somehow life was better in the 1950s, or somehow life was better in the the 1850s, or
That's
even
right.
People say, oh, I'd really like to I would have loved to have lived in the 18th century. Really?
Sure.
Where you could cut your finger and die of an infection, like
right. Where your life expectancy was 30 to 40.
Yeah, right.
It's interesting. Before I get to that point, I just want to say hi, Chris Rulli. He just pointed out Black Mirror now is to Twilight Zone what it was in the 50s,
you go.
Right?
Absolutely.
Same thing. Totally true. But it's interesting, right? Is that the idea of always looking back to those things, right? And harking back to our past in some way is a romance, in one definition.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I find it very, very interesting and how these things are used. And we call it a romance, not because it's in what we were talking about, which is the Romantic period, which had to do with Romanism,
right?
And Rome, the roots of what happened in Rome. But
right.
This kind of romance is a gauzy feeling of comfort and love for a bygone era that honestly didn't exist.
Right.
It's only clouded in our own minds.
Right.
I watched a really cool documentary actually about that. It was about Hal Riney, who's a real famous ad guy.
Hal Riney.
That's right. And it was really interesting. Hal Riney is really famous, for those of you who don't know.
I met Hal Riney once.
I hate you for that.
I used to freelance for Hal Riney. So for those who don't know, Hal Riney was an ad guy. He owned an ad agency called Hal Riney. Well, he was
Associates.
Yeah. So he had an ad agency called Hal Riney and Associates, and he was for those of a certain age, he was the guy who made the ad for Reagan, the Morning in America.
It's Morning in America.
Yeah, it's Morning in America. And if you ever listen to Prairie Home
Taxes
Companion, Like Garrison Keillor was parodying Hal Riney with his ketchup ads, like ketchup.
Exactly.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And the thing is that so Hal Riney then took that same shtick and spun it into Ernest and Julio Gallo wine. He spun it for Country Time Lemonade. He spun it for Saturn, the car company. He spun it for there's someone else I'm forgetting. It's another giant company. The thing is, and they're all the same ad. They're all literally the same ad when you start watching them.
Yes, yeah.
But what's hilarious about it is that they're all the same ad. They're all hearkening back to a time that doesn't exist and a place that doesn't exist. This sort of middle America utopia that always lives right at that golden hour of sunset or sunrise, depending on kind of what you're doing. If you're raising the flag, it's sunrise. And if you're, coming home from the farm with, your gloves in your back pocket of your dungarees, that's sunset. And the thing is, that doesn't exist. It just doesn't.
And it's funny. He was better than anyone at doing this. And in fact, I can tell you, like, here's a little Hal Riney story. When I freelanced there, I was working as a art director, as a designer. And when they would make ads, they would try to keep them away from him. Especially if they were good, because he would always want to read them himself, and they would want to hire like a voice talent to like read the ad, and he'd be like, "Oh no, I'll read it." No, you're like, no. But like, what are you gonna say? It's the boss.
Well, and not only that, but the guy had a great voice.
Yeah, he did.
He did. But I mean, but I find him really, really interesting. I think he's a very, very interesting guy. But he still doesn't even really know. And they had all these interviews of professionals who were his peers, really, who are able to now to then. I mean, Hal's dead. Sorry, but spoiler alert. But they were able to say, even when he was alive, like, listen, Hal lives in his own world.
Yeah,
but it's a world.
It's a great world.
It's a world that every American wants to live in too. And Hal just it's realized inside him. And that thing is that he was a deep thinker. He wasn't an idiot in any way just because he made the same commercial 800 times. But he wasn't an idiot. He knew what he was looking back on, and what all these other people were doing. This romanticism is kind of the way, it's the key into their emotions. And that's kind of what he's saying here is what they're doing, even in the 18th century, right? Is that they're trying to look inward into this, into this place
and I think we do that
they
today.
don't understand any more than they understood the technology.
Yeah,
but it felt safer.
Yeah, Yeah, and I think we sort of we've carried some of that into our Masonry of today, right? Where we look back on
absolutely.
Those golden days when we had big temples and things were so much better
hundreds
then.
of members.
Right. Well, but here's the thing: Illuminism is different. Like, Illuminism is not full blown romantic movement. Illuminism is like Brother Faivre says is a pre-romantic kind of start to that. What he says about it is that Illuminism advocated the idea of the possibility of a spiritual experience of the supernatural. And here again, we find at that period, the emphasis placed on the notion of sensorial experience. So kind of a direct sensory experience. Occult sciences were willingly developed and different currents drawn together, which in order to respect their close relationship, we've agreed to group under the name Esoteric. And he talks about these in terms of like Neo-Rosicrucianism, Kabbalah, Theosophy, alchemy, tarot, Egyptology, like the Egyptology craze was part of this, right? And Hermeticism, that sort of constitutes, what we would call the Western esoteric tradition. He says it tended to imagine or exaggerate a natural relationship and an uninterrupted transmission between Blue Masonry and the various medieval traditions with religious connotations. And above all, the idea was that the three first grades could be well based on certain alchemist, Kabbalistic, or Rosicrucian teachings. Thus, an attempt was made to exaggerate the influence that a scholar such as Elias Ashmole and the Royal Society might have exercised over the emerging Freemasonry in the matter of alchemy and Rosicrucianism. This is kind of interesting when I read this because, I was thinking about Robert Cooper, right, who wrote the book, The Rosalind Hoax, which, it's like, if you want to make him crazy, just, ask him the directions to Rosalind Chapel and ask him for the Masonic tour. He'll just,
right.
It's just because he's looking at it from an empirical standpoint, and so many people are sort of looking at it from a more romantic standpoint. I mean, we would really love to believe that the Masons, were the direct descendants of the Templars, right? It would make us, hey, that makes us Templars, kind of, sort of. So it's definitely a part of Masonry. It's not an invalid part of Masonry by any stretch of the imagination, right? It's part of the corpus of what we do and what we seek. But it, we have to kind of recognize it for what it is in terms of the intellectual movement. And so what he then goes on to describe is that there are these two conferences. He said that this diversity, especially from the middle of the 18th century, raised questions about the question of what Freemasonry itself might be. Was it essentially a school of ethics, or was it rooted in currents of the esoteric? And so he goes on to describe, and I won't read too much of this, these two different conferences where they tried to figure it out, and they couldn't. Like they couldn't kind of come to terms with it. Like they couldn't, and what they couldn't do was they couldn't say that Masonry was one or the other.
Right.
Right. There were both.
There was no definition.
Yeah.
Right.
That there were both threads running through this. And so he kind of reflects on this. He says, apart from personal quarrels, inevitable in every human society, at that time, the supporters of one and the other orientation fraternized today as then within the same blue lodges. The essence of what united them was not so much their adhering to one or the other of these lights, these different paths, then they're practicing the same ritual in a spirit of fraternity and common moral ideal. To understand them, not only in contradiction, but also in complementarity. Both sides have arguments which respond to the crisis of the metaphysical and moral foundations suffered at the time. The reaction was especially directed against the dogmatism of the churches. And then he goes on, he says, the second key implied by the two luminous orientations was the notion of the perfectibility of the individual, of society, of the human race, and of nature. It was linked to the notion of progress. So when he says progress, they mean progress with a capital P. And one of those, I think, threads of progress was a social progress, and one of them was sort of a spiritual progress.
Yeah, I'll buy that.
And then he says, an essential function of Freemasonry was thus to defy the binary opposition of the old and the new, the traditional and the modern, the reason and the imagination, the individual and the social, the mythological and the real. This was done by harmonizing reason, imagination, and will within a framework allowing escape from the bonds of secular and religious intimations. And that kind of blew my mind, right?
Yeah, that's huge. I mean, that's huge. I mean, that's huge today. Yeah. Can you imagine what that meant then?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, when your life was defined by the church.
Yeah.
I mean, in even Protestantism back then would have still defined,
sure,
most of your moral compass, most of your day-to-day life. I mean, that it's insane to divorce that.
Right. But what I think he's saying is that because Masonry contains these two paths,
sure, right,
each path tempers the other. right?
Correct.
So
Right.
you know, what prevents Freemasonry from going into this, completely intellectual, basically club for science nerds, right?
That's right.
Is this need for esoteric reflection, based on the idea that we do have to believe in a supreme being, whatever that is, right? Reference last show, right?
Right.
But by the same token, that esoteric thread needs to be tempered by critical thinking.
Right.
Right. Which, if you look on Facebook, on certain Masonic groups, there's a real lack of that. Even in the, like, it's really funny. There's a group. It's a closed group, called, I think it's called like the Kabbalah and Mysticism group or something like that. But it's one of the groups that I'm a member of, and I have a total love-hate relationship with it. I kind of love to hate it. Wait, what's it called here? Let me just see if I can find it. I'm just pulling up Facebook and it's going really slow. You know what occurs to me? I'm a member of way too many groups.
Gee, go figure.
Oh, here it's called
said the Freemason.
Yeah, right. Kabbalah, and Kabbalah. So Kabbalah with a K, Kabbalah with a Q, Kabbalah with a C, study. And just some of the crazy stuff that appears in this group, like without any critical thinking. So I was reading this one thread that, that the word Kabbalah itself comes from, what was it? The word Israel. Israel was made up of the words is, right, meaning Isis, Ra, which is the sun god, and El, which is the Canaanite god, which is complete nonsense. I mean, when you look at like just basic Semitic language, it's like, no, it's not that at all. But that's kind of what you're up against when you.
Chris really just wrote Beetlejuice.
But when you lose yourself down that path without the faculties of critical thinking, that's you end up in places like that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I've had this conversation with Art DeHoyas, a very, very accomplished occultist. And Art has always told me, as I've, read books and studied things, he's always said, temper. Don't ever let yourself slide into these things, because as soon as you do, he said, you put one toe in, it's real easy to go over your head fast. And he's always told me, Freemasonry is great for the occultist because it acts as an anchor for your studies. And what he's saying there is exactly what's being written here, which it tells you about how, these two personalities exist together and temper each other, and they help each other. They hold you within due bounds. And I think further, if you look at the Scottish Rite, they let you go through the whole weekend before they tell you the one thing that you're going to take away from the Scottish Rite.
Uh-huh.
I'm not going to spoil it. No. But I mean,
it was all a dream. It was all a dream.
Right. It's the ending of St. Elsewhere. But I just, it's interesting to me that you hear it in many, many different ways. It's said different ways. Art calls it the anchor. And here it's being more clearly stated that really these studies complement each other and keep them sort of on a straight path towards that capital P progress. Is interesting to me.
That's
really interesting to me.
So here's my, I when you said that, you made this gesture, right? Wait, let me get in front of my camera here. You made this gesture.
Yeah, there you go.
Right?
That's the one. Yeah.
And I immediately thought of the point within a circle, right? With the two tangent lines.
There you go. There you go. Absolutely. There you go. That's great.
Yeah.
See, we're sliding down the hole ourselves. But I mean, but there's something to that, you know. What's interesting to me is that every time, so I'm a very, very, very rational thinker. I am very rigid and logical. I don't have a very strong faith in things that I can't touch, feel, understand. But that being said, one thing that's always got me about Freemasonry, and it really gets me, is there are some things in Masonry that just kind of pop you in the mouth and go, that's not an accident. That's probably one of them, right? I could say another one off the air.
So for people who are just listening, he raised his hands in you know, like a referee would if you made a field goal.
Sure. Right.
Yeah.
The point within the circle. Yeah. Actually, and I was even going like this, but in the first degree, you know, there are answers a candidate gives. Those aren't on accident. And there are all these little threads of things that when someone points them out to you as you kind of go along this thing, you say, oh, yeah, that's not an accident. That is absolutely on purpose, and that was left here. It's left here for me to figure out and to find out. And it just blows your mind. And there is something deeper there. So every time my little rational brain says there's nothing deeper, this is a dress-up club for men. Don't worry. You're just having fun. Then all of a sudden, you know, another little birdie says, oh, no, this is on purpose. They gave you this symbol for a very specific reason for you to figure out.
Yeah.
Oh, jeez. That's painful. So they're constantly going back and forth. They're constantly balancing each other.
So it's interesting.
An equilibrium, if you would.
Yeah.
Royal secret. Sorry.
So what I find though interesting too is that these notions also exist in Kabbalah, right?
Yeah.
Right. You have one you know, one side of the tree of life that is sort of what they would call convergent, right? Mm-hmm. And one that is divergent, mm-hmm. right? So the idea in creative theory. So one of the things as a designer and ad guy, one of the things that I've always been very interested in is trying to understand the creative process. Mm-hmm. And you know, there's two kinds of thinking. One is divergent thinking, where you kind of go crazy and explore, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the other is convergent thinking. So divergent thinking, like an example of that would be brainstorming, right? So they tell you in brainstorming, like, no idea is bad, and you put everything up on the wall, and you know, you don't judge. You just get as many ideas out. That's divergent thinking. And then when you get all the crap on the wall, you got to pull the crap down and leave the good stuff up, right? You got to cull it, right? And that's the critical faculties. That's. I
remember being in an ad room once, and I'm saying, all right, we're going to brainstorm. There are no bad ideas until we're done brainstorming, and then I'm going to point out all of the bad ideas that are on this board.
Yeah,
we are going to mercilessly mock you.
That's right. Yeah, there you go. And so, which, yeah, we do that all the time in advertising. Yeah. Right. So, but that culling, that, you know, that's Gevura, right? And the chesed is no, it's all good. It's all good. Throw it up there, you know? Right. Yeah, right. And so those two aspects. So you need, so to me, the esoteric path, right, is the esoteric side is that divergent side. It's the power of imagination. It allows us to sort of go out and ask, you know, like there's a thing, a really interesting thing called the Oracle effect. Have you ever heard of this? The Oracle effect?
No. Enlighten us, Eric.
Okay. So the Oracle effect happens when you consult an Oracle, and like, a really good example of this is the I Ching. Right. So the I Ching is this, Chinese book of changes, right? And you basically ask it
the bones.
Yeah. Right. You ask it a question, you toss some coins, you get a reading, right? And then it'll tell you this kind of thing. And it's very poetic and kind of vague, you know. So it says, you know, the wise man will be circumspect about blah, blah, blah. And, you know, and you then kind of say, okay, now what the hell does that mean? And you start bringing that idea into your own experience and you start forcing connections, right? And it's that forced connections, that's where creativity happens. That's a creative act, right? And that's called the oracle effect. So when you read tarot, right, and you throw a tarot card down, and it's the card is like the six of staffs or wands or whatever, right? And you look at that and you say, oh, what's happening in the card, and what does it symbolize, and what does it mean, and blah blah. Now, how does it apply to me, right?
Right.
You start making connections, because that's what we do as humans. We seek meaning. We love mystery.
Our brains are wired that way.
Yeah. We love mystery, but we hate the idea of an unsolved mystery.
I always had that problem reading The Art of War, because The Art of War is not about really war as much as it's about conflict.
Right.
And so conflict is constantly in our lives. Whether that's an interpersonal conflict, whether it's a decision conflict that you're having, that kind of stuff, the conflict is always there. And when you read The Art of War, whatever conflict is top of your mind is immediately applied to the lessons that are taught in The Art of War, because it's so vague, the general who has the high ground will always win. Well, what does that mean? How do I get the high ground on,
right.
And that's it. Yeah, I totally get it. Okay. So that's the oracle effect. All right, good.
That's called the oracle effect. So I think what we're saying is that Freemasonry, in having these two paths, gives us a complete synthesis system for making the world a better place, right? Yeah. Starting with ourselves, right?
Sure, I'll buy that.
But not limiting it to ourselves, right?
Correct.
Being able to go further, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
that's interesting.
Yeah. And so Brother Faivre says the bipolarity is the fact that Freemasonry at the time is at the same time a spearhead of modernity by its affinities with the spirit of enlightenment, and a conservatory of other cultural treasures revisited by the Masonic Illuminism, which the latter tends to gather under the term tradition, often written with a capital T.
Such an obnoxious sentence in so many ways, but yes.
Why is it obnoxious?
It meanders. It is so dense. What's interesting about it is that it's a relatively short sentence. It's a normal size sentence that is way too long, because it's so densely packed with ideas.
Well, that's academic writing.
No, it is, and it's frustrating because it's really good. And if you take the time to really let that sentence sink in and understand its meaning, it's fantastic. It's really, really cool. And you should read on, because the next one's good too.
So he says, fortunately, there are ways of contributing to the fact that it remains a space of interpretive freedom and dialogue. This is particularly the case for critical thinking. By exercising it, for example, with regard to books, articles, and conferences, which are legion and emanate from Masons, merely exposing their own conception of the Masonic order and its symbols, while being careful not to recall that this is not the only way of thinking, and that other readings exist also in the same way constitute our society, which is a kind of a long, obnoxious sentence. But I think what he's saying is that, by using critical thinking, we are taught that there's not one way of doing Masonry. There's not one way of
that's right.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And that by just the practice of Masonry, just by the idea of even dipping your toe into esotericism, or dipping your toe into rational thought, as it relates to Enlightenment thinking, necessarily pushes you forward. And not only that, but like what he's talking about here about conferences and talking to other Masons, is that you're constantly exposed to more either challenges or maybe even breadcrumbs on that path towards what you're really looking for.
Right.
You see, and I think that's what he's really saying there, is that like the practice of Masonry it doesn't just happen within you. It starts within you, but then you externalize that. And then another Mason is doing the same process. And then that starts to mold both of you. And then that moves out and it moves out. And hopefully that's what externalizes it and makes our society better.
Yeah. Yeah. And he kind of closes it. I won't read his last statement because he's just sort of being a little bit flip, I think. But he does say that, he says, to each his preference, and a diversity of voices within the same lodge allows members to know each other better and testifies to the lodge's vitality. But this does not mean that brothers can claim the right to present their choice in a prescriptive manner in this type of case, by attempting to oppose it directly by speech or indirectly, implicitly by making allusions. There is nothing better, in fact, to put young brothers in disarray and to create sterile dissensions within lodge, which, one thing leading to another, are likely to have unfortunate repercussions at the level of obedience. So what he's saying is, like, there's no better way to screw up a lodge than to put your foot down and say, this is how we do things, and screw you. And, you know, like,
that's exactly right.
Right.
Right. That's absolutely right. Is to close off the ideas.
Yeah.
That's interesting. It's a really cool paper. It's a really thought-provoking paper.
Yeah.
When
I
you really
love
think
reading
about
this
it.
guy. He's so thoughtful, and it's like he's got other books. I wish, full disclosure, I'm in Illinois, I'm the grand rep to France. And so I'm planning on going to pay them a visit in the autumn of this year. And one of the things I want to ask them is if they can make this available electronically, because I think now to get this, I got this only because they sent a complimentary copy to my Grand Lodge, and they said, you're the Grand Rep, you should have a copy of this.
So by the way, I didn't know that. I thought that they had sent another one. I thought this was like the second issue that you were sending me. This is that first issue. That was like last year.
Yeah, it was last year. It's funny. I've read it. I read it.
I have this on my desk.
I've been reading it. I've been reading it for a long time, and rereading it. And then, like, when I kind of got on this Enlightenment kick, and I started thinking about, how the Enlightenment, like, kind of reconnecting it was this. I think it as an important idea in Masonry.
Mm-hmm.
And I reread this. I'm like, oh, that's what he meant. Like,
right.
It was sort of like reading it again for the first time. And that's
totally.
A good Masonic paper will do that to you, like,
absolutely.
All of a sudden something happens and you go back and read it and go, oh, that's what that means.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. 100%.
So, I'll again, we'll put the link to the book if you want to, and I urge you to get it. It's really good. Mm-hmm. One thing I noticed about the papers, a lot of them deal with religious subjects, and that might be because I think the GLNF, first of all, that they do have a religious requirement, and I think they're not really, like, sort of Christian oriented, but I think the fact that France is a majority Christian country, they tended to focus more on a lot of these papers tended to focus on more Christian ideas, but they're still really good. And I learned a lot from them, even not being Christian, but that's, it's a,
or do you think it's just compensation for the other Grand Lodge, which is completely irreligious? And
so, maybe. Well, I think
maybe it's them compensating a little too much. Well,
maybe, but here's the thing. I mean, in that marketplace of ideas where you have, what is it? Three Grand Lodges, essentially, major Grand Lodges in France, right? You have the Grand Orient of France, which is the sort of secular Grand Lodge. You have the Grand Lodge de France, which is the regular Grand Lodge. They also require a belief in Supreme Being, but because the GLNF was recognized before the Grand Lodge de France, we don't recognize the Grand Lodge de France. So there's that Grand Lodge, and then there's the GLNF. And I think the GLNF of the three is the smallest of the three.
Right. Correct.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So, but yeah, it's all good stuff. The like I said, the quality of the writing is really, really high. But I think what this kind of tells us, to kind of wrap this up, is that we have to that if we focus on the esoteric to the detriment, to the ignoring of the Enlightenment part of this, to the critical thinking part of this, we're losing half the point within a circle diagram. We're losing half that capability, and it does not serve Masonry well, and it doesn't serve mankind well. That would
Agreed.
That would be my thing.
Yeah. It can't be said better.
So, any other comments from the comments?
No, although
Okay.
I must have missed one. Ruli just said Larry Page just slaps you. I don't know what that. I
Who's
missed
Larry
that.
Page? Oh well.
I don't know. I missed it.
So so we'll be talking about Enlightenment more this season, and we want to know what you think, obviously, and let us know. Drop us a line at X-Oriente@gmail.com, or leave a comment on our Facebook page or on our blog at X-Oriente.com. This is really supposed to be a dialogue, and we want to get your voices into the mixes as well. One of the things I'd like to do is see if we can get like some kind of call-in capability. Wouldn't that be cool?
That'd be super cool. That'd be really fun.
Yeah, we got to figure out a way.
That'd be a great idea.
Wouldn't it?
That'd be a really fun thing to do. That would be really fun.
Yeah. And you know what? Here's,
really points out Larry Page is the Oracle CEO.
Oh, that Larry Page. Yeah. Yep.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's okay.
Sorry, Chris.
Wait, I thought Larry Ellison was the
Yeah, that's
Oracle.
Larry Ellison. He's thinking of Page's. Isn't Page?
Isn't he one of the Google guys?
He is. Yeah, Larry Page is one of the Google guys.
Oh, okay.
So, Page and no, damn it! Now I'm screwed up.
well.
Screw all these tech people. Stupid billionaires.
So here's the thing too. If you want to send us an audio message, just go into your voice recorder on your smartphone and just leave us an audio message. Just email it to us or send it to us. We'll play it on the air. We'd love to hear it. Just keep it clean, sorta clean. Just be nice. And then again, we want to thank our executive producers for making this all possible.
Thank you.
And if you want to become an executive producer, you can do so by visiting our Patreon page. That's patreon.com/X-Oriente. You can pledge to keep this show going. One of the things you might have noticed if you follow the live feed is that the quality of the connection has been a lot better, and that's because Rabbi Jason has gotten a better bandwidth. So again, thank you.
Thank you
for that. So that's about it for this episode. Again, let us know what you think, and keep thinking critically, and keep the spiritual exploration going.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Good night.
Fiat Vox.